नमस्ते, हमेशा खुश रहो बिटिया. I am JVN Dr. Lily Trivedi, and today I am going to give a lecture on disaster cycle. Now let's come to what is disaster. If we see what is disaster, it is the it is the total sum of all activities with disaster management that are taken, all the programs, all the measures which are taken up during or after disaster with the purpose to avoid a disaster. So that is the disaster cycle. Now, as for the disaster, what is disaster? It is an unforeseen event which takes place and there is a risk of there is a risk and there is vulnerability and a hazard, and what happens, there is damage. There is damage to the society, to the life, to property. So all these are the disasters. So we have studied disaster in previous lectures. So today we are going to study what is disaster cycle when we are in the disaster management. So the disaster cycle consists of disaster response, that is post disaster, then there is post disaster recovery, then there is pre disaster risk reduction. Now if we see the disaster, when a disaster is striking, what happens? When a disaster strikes, when the disaster strikes, at that time I'm going to show you, share the screen and show you. Yes. Now when a disaster strikes, there is the response. First is the individual response, that is secure your safety and of others and rescue and provide first aid and secure supply. This is all during disaster. Then the second is the response or the emergency response or disaster response or after a disaster is the response and relief, the intermediate intervention. That means there is search and rescue for the people, security, food, water is provided, sanitation is there, shelter is provided, clothes, medical services, and trauma care center. So this is a short duration time period activity. Now after this is the post disaster, that is the rehabilitation. That is, we are restoring the basic services, the function and the function. Now this can take from weeks to months time. Whereas reconstruction, the next cycle is full of resumption of service plus preventive measures, and this can range between months to years. So this is the post disaster recovery. Now after this, in the cycle, we have the pre-disaster risk reduction. So we are getting prepared for the next disaster which can occur in the same form in the coming time. So what are the activities that come under the pre-disaster risk reduction is preparedness and mitigation. Now preparedness is the contingency planning, the warning, the evacuation, and the consolidation preparation for the next disaster. And mitigation is the risk assessment or the prevention, which includes the hazard mapping, the vulnerability assessment, that is the structural and non-structural measures. So this is a disaster cycle when we are dealing with the disaster management. So students, as we have studied the components of the disaster cycle, so the pre-disaster we revise once again, that means that there are those activities which reduce the human and property loss. For example, if we are creating awareness program, we are strengthening the existing weak structure. We are preparing the management plans, disaster management plans at household and community level. So these are the risk reduction measures which are taken and they are termed as mitigation of preparedness activities. Now what happens during the disaster occurrence. The needs and provisions of the victims have to be met and their suffering have to be minimized. So as such, the activity taken under are the emergency response activities. So these emergency response activities include the health emergency also. Now, the post-disaster, that is after the disaster has taken place, there is initiative taken in response to disaster with the purpose to achieve early recovery and rehabilitation of the affected community. Now, this is taken immediately after the disaster has taken place. So, they are called as response and recovery activities. So, the disaster management risk cycle highlights the range of initiatives which normally occur during emergency, both during emergency response and the recovery stages of the disaster. But what is there are unique activities are early warning and evacuation, reconstruction and economic social recovery. But what happens here? There is sudden onset disaster and slow disaster, slow onset. So sudden onset disasters include flood, earthquake, bushfire, cyclones. They are taking place very fast and for a slow time period. But we have the slow onset disaster, that is the drought. So here the emergency response stage is not so fast. But all the ultimately, what is the main? The main is to minimize the losses. So the disaster cycle gives the ongoing process by which the governments, the business, and the civil society plans for and reduce the impact of disaster. How they react during the disaster, immediately disaster, following a disaster, and what steps they take. What are the steps they have taken for the preparedness, the warning, the reduced vulnerability for the next disaster. So the complete disaster management cycle includes the shaping of public policy, plans that can modify the cause of disaster or mitigate their effect on the people, property, and infrastructure. So the mitigation and preparation phases are made in anticipation of another disaster event, and the developmental considerations play a great role in contributing to the mitigation and preparation of the community to confront a disaster. As such, the disaster management includes the four main phases, and these four main phases are as already studied, but they can overlap on. So we can't draw a separating line. So it depends on the severity of disaster. So the first phase, as already studied, is mitigation, that is minimizing the effect. Second is preparation, how we plan for it. Third is response, what are the efforts taken to minimize the hazard. And fourth is recovery, that is returning the community to normal. So students, I hope you have found my lecture interesting. If you have any query, please give in the comment box. I will resolve it soon. This session was powered by digital version 2.0 of JVWU Disaster Women's University. Namaste.